My daughter said that I would get nothing from my ex-husband's $56.00 mill, but the lawyer makes her kneel down and said I arrived in her grand home that night as if I were a ghost, draped in a too-thin coat meant to last a single evening. The ballroom lights sparkled over crystal wine glasses, shimmering mirrors, and ornate gold leaf moldings. Laughter and champagne floated through the air, mingling with music that pulsed like a heartbeat of arrogance. I had helped make this house possible with every dollar of my small retirement savings, and yet I sat alone on a velvet chair, tucked against a wall, like a painting to be ignored. Then Lydia stood up, her voice rising above the chatter, loud enough to pull every eye in the room to me. "Listen to me clearly," she said, her tone sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Father is dead, and in his will he left $56 million, and you will not see a penny of it. You are nothing more than a decaying old carcass feeding off us. You should know your place. Get out and find a nursing home that will take you." A stunned silence fell. Then I heard Lydia press on. "With that stench of yours, you make my guests lose their appetite. Go down to the kitchen if you must eat scraps. At least stay out of sight and spare us the shame." It was not just Lydia. Across the room, a few well-dressed relatives and friends stifled giggles behind their champagne flutes. One wealthy aunt leaned over to another and whispered, loud enough for me to hear, "Poverty smells like you can never scrub it out." Derek, my son-in-law, stepped forward, his voice full of scorn. "An old hag like you should just die quietly somewhere. You are embarrassing us by existing." I rose to my feet as Lydia stalked across the polished marble floor and ripped the framed photo from the wall, a black and white snapshot of my deceased husband cradling a toddler, Lydia, both faces lit with joy. Without a word, she hurled it to the ground. The glass frame shattered in a spray of shards, the picture itself bending, curling toward the floor. I knelt on the hard tile, gathering the broken glass and the image of my husband and daughter. One shard sliced into my palm, and I felt warmth spreading on my skin. I dabbed at it with the hem of my coat, the red stain melding with the dust and memory on the photograph. I lifted my eyes and saw a room, frozen in contempt. Faces turned away, murmurs of disgust. A hush that cut deeper than any word. My gaze met Lydia's for a moment. I saw triumph there, the victor full of herself. Then I looked away, gulped in the fragrance of roses arranged in crystal vases, felt the weight of my own blood on my hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand dignity. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, inhaling the scent of the room and of betrayal. Then I stood and tucked the stained photo into my coat pocket and walked out. The ache that settled in my chest after that humiliating dinner did not belong to one moment. It had its roots in a lifetime of choices made in silence. Now, in the stillness of my small rented room, I traced the scars of those choices. When Lydia was accepted into that well-regarded university, I sold my wedding band, and even the locket her father had given me on our last anniversary, to pay for her tuition. My hands trembled as I slipped the rings into the jeweler's rough hand, thinking of Lydia years ago proudly showing her school friends the shining gold. I told myself it was just metal, a means to an end, but every time her grades came in, or she called me to say she had passed another exam, the locket's absence felt like a wound reopened. I believed I was doing right. I believed in sacrifices made quietly, but when her father's affair came to light, I chose silence. I swallowed my betrayal and carried on, believing that she needed a father more than she needed the truth. I watched him leave one night, carrying his suitcase, his apology lost in the darkness. But I said nothing. I rubbed my cheek where his lips had once promised the world, and let her memories stay pure. She never knew the universe we lived in was fractured long before he walked out. Years later, when she learned a hidden envelope, stamped from another woman's hand, rested at the bottom of that locked drawer, she accused me with venom. If you had stood up and fought, he would not have left. You ruined him and this family. She paused, eyes blazing, then delivered the final blow. You gave me a childhood of poverty. I had to carry the weight you refused to bear. That is your fault. My hands shook at breakfast as I held her letter, months old, but fresh with accusation. Every morning I had boiled eggs and made toast, pretending to be strong, but inside it felt like dying. There was no mapping of the fault, not in how I sold chattel for her studies, not in how I masked betrayal to preserve her image, not in how I bent to keep a home that was already breaking. Yet to her, my every attempt was a misstep. I remember a winter morning when Liddy was 8, pulling me by the sleeve, rushing me outside so her friends could touch the blue sweater I had knitted her. She laughed and twirled, eyes bright, saying how warm it was. That knit, uneven and full of dropped stitches, was my pride. Years later, in college, when cleaning her closet, she saw that same sweater and said, "Mom, these look cheap. Don't let anyone see them." And she flinched when she discarded it into the trash, like she had scrapped a piece of my soul. To her, my loyalty to preserve memory, to protect illusion, was weakness. My sacrifices, my literal pieces of myself given for her, were painted as disgrace. And in the glare of their judgment I realized how nothing I did had ever been enough. A mosaic of miscommunication, bitterness, expectation, and love, twisted beyond recognition. So, on that evening when Lydia stood in front of our relatives, on her husband's arm, and declared, "Father left because she was nothing, and I feel the same. From today forward, she is no longer my mother," the words were not just a rejection. They were the culmination of every unspoken truth, every invisible sacrifice made invisible. I bowed my head, held the silent grief in my chest like a stone, and stepped back. Because it was not simply that my identity as a mother had been erased. It was that all the notes, letters, tuition bills, empty food cans, melting candle wax, and tears I shed in quiet corners, all of those things had been inverted into blame, into a story where the mother's love became the child's curse. And in that very moment, surrounded by the gasps of relatives and the wide eyes of friends, I understood that I would need to reclaim my story, not with noise, but with truth. I arrived at the funeral home before the service began, clutching a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums, flowers that, to me, signified purity and farewell. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and cheap cologne, the kind meant to mask grief with formality. I stepped out of the taxi and straightened, taking a deep breath before I walked forward, past the polished marble floors. For a fleeting moment, I thought that I deserved just a seat in the periphery, an acknowledgement of my past, before I was plunged into exile by a daughter who believed she held all the power. But Lydia was waiting at the entrance, her posture rigid, her eyes cold enough to freeze every memory I had lovingly held on to. She gasped at me as soon as she saw me, and with all the conciseness of malice she could muster, she spat out, "Mother, what are you doing here? Are you here to beg for attention?" Her words echoed through the silent hallway, and heads turned. I felt every eye on me, measured me, decided I was irrelevant. I stayed silent, gripping the chrysanthemums, petals trembling as my heart clenched. I hadn't come for their pity or their applause. I had come to stand where dignity belonged, but before I could move forward, a tall man in a suit, a hired security guard, stepped in front of me. Lydia's voice cut the air. "That's enough. Move aside, or I will have you escorted out. This is for the family. You are no longer part of this family." The guard hesitated for a second, and then moved to block my way, as if I were some interloper unworthy of funeral rites. Friends and relatives looked on, some sneering behind pursed lips. One woman clicked on her phone. Of all things, being abandoned at her husband's funeral, what a disgrace. A few nodded knowingly, feeding into the moment, suggesting that humiliation was my place. I stood motionless, tears threatening at the edges of my vision, holding those chrysanthemums as though they were carved from stone, even more fragile than I felt. When I finally managed to make my way down the aisle of chairs, I noticed the emptiest end, the far corner where the air was coldest. I sat there carefully, arranging the bouquet on the seat beside me, taking up as little space as possible. Even that small act seemed too much. Lydia stepped in front of me, glaring as she delivered the lethal words. "That seat is for the family. You need to go. You are not part of us anymore." Her voice dripped finality. She turned to the guard and nodded. He stepped forward, arm outstretched, guiding me with the implication not of care, but of containment. I rose, not willing, not compliant, but I raised with ease that surprised even me. I gathered my flowers, the stems cutting into my palm, and I moved, quietly, deliberately, toward the exit, yet the guard came behind me to ensure I did not linger. I felt the stairs focus on me like surgical lamps. I put one tentative foot in the corridor when Lydia surged forward, ripped the flowers from my hands, and flung them onto the carpet with such force the petals scattered across the polished floor. The white blooms fluttered like wounded birds. She snarled, "Your husband is dead, and you, so much shame, mean nothing now. Tomorrow you will end up with..." Her voice was tremulous with cruelty. The room inhaled and held its breath. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. A few eyes darted away. But in that cruel theater, the echo of Lydia's words resounded in my bones. I knelt and carefully gathered each flower petal. My fingers shook as they sought the fragile white blooms, each of them a memory of love, now crushed beneath the weight of dismissal. I wrapped them gently into a piece of my coat. My cheeks were wet, but I did not sob. Tears for me were private, their presence not meant for scandal. My lips pressed shut, and I lifted my stained eyes, calm and dry, rising as quietly as if releasing a held breath. I walked down the aisle of chairs I had vowed to reclaim, and I carried those petals like a secret vow. My steps were measured, but unbowed. A life of sacrifice vanished, but here, on that cold funeral home carpet, I discovered that silence can hold more strength than screams ever could. I left with the chrysanthemum petals tucked in the pocket of my coat, my own witness to the life unavenged, the love unappreciated. And in that slow departure, I acknowledged that sorrow can be powerful when clothed in dignity, and that a mother's worth is not erased by accusation, even when her own daughter tries to erase her. That night, I returned not to shame, but to quiet resolve. In the silence of my rented room, surrounded by old photographs and fading memories, I knew something had shifted. Not in them, but in me. The hurt was no less, but I now carried it with clarity. I no longer waited for justice. I had seen its face. And it looked like peace. The next day would change everything. I returned to the little room I had rented on the edge of town, carrying only a faded suitcase and the weight of unspoken truths. The carpet was threadbare, the lamp's bulb flickered, and the only window faced the back alley, where a solitary streetlight cast a yellow glow. It was cold there, but preferable to the chill of their disdain. Inside, I unlocked an old wooden chest, my only piece of furniture besides the bed. I lifted the lid and found what remained of my life's final works. Yellowed tuition bills with my daughter's name scrawled on them, receipts for payments made toward my husband's mounting debts, the last of my savings sacrificed in tiny increments. And there, tucked in a battered envelope, lay a folded letter I had never forgotten, yet never burned. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the letter. His handwriting was weak, but unmistakable. "My dearest, I have been unfaithful. It has been the greatest shame of my life. I beg you to keep this secret from Lydia. She must believe in the father she loves. If the truth surfaces, it will shatter her like glass. I am sorry. I loved you always." I closed the letter slowly. Years ago I had burned many of his letters, but this one I preserved because I believed, however naively, that it was hers to carry someday. I remembered the weight of it in my skirt pocket when I kissed her goodbye for her first day of school. I remembered folding it carefully and slipping it between the pages of her favorite book. I wept quietly then, not from scandal, but from love. I looked around the room, the thin blanket, the peeling wallpaper, the single photograph I had found in a thrift store, showing Lydia holding my grandmother's hand. Time, in that instant, became a knife slicing through memory and reality. I folded the letter and laid it on top of the tuition receipts. I stood over that chest of relics as if holding the axis of my life. Every night I had whispered to myself, I did this so she could have a future, so she could believe in something bigger than fear. But here, with the letter exposed to light, I realized the future had come, but I had been erased from it. I sank onto the edge of the bed and closed my eyes. My mind whispered the truth I had never spoken. I raised her twice, once with my body and milk, and again with my tears. Yet she remembers only the moments I faltered, not the times I carried the weight of the world so she would walk straight. I stayed there, silent, tears gathering in the corners of my eyes, but not falling. I was not broken. I was preparing. I had gathered evidence of my life, the receipts of sacrifice, of love, of betrayal, each one a testament not to wrongdoing, but to endurance. And in the quiet of that room I made my decision. I would not speak my truths in defense. I would not beg for remembrance. I would leave the chest unlocked, the truth ready to speak for itself when the time came. Let the world judge then, with eyes open. Before sleep claimed me, I whispered into the silent air, "Your shame is not mine. The truth will come, and it will stand, even if I fade." I sat there until dawn, the letter heavy in my chest, and I understood that I was preparing not for confrontation, but for justice. The air inside the attorney's office was saturate with expectation and hushed whispers, like a church before judgment. Dozens of chairs were filled, family, friends, colleagues, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the promise of something dramatic. I sat in the back row, clutching my purse with trembling fingers. The overhead lights pressed down like silent jury members. Lydia leaned close to the woman beside her and hissed low enough that only her friend could hear. "Prepare yourself. There is absolutely no way my mother's name will appear anywhere in that will." Her tone was brimming with confidence, dripping with pride. The attorney rose and cleared his throat. The room stilled. He opened a thick folder and produced a USB drive. He paused, then plugged it into the computer at the front. A soft click echoed. A screen flickered to life at the front of the room, and the low hum of conversation died completely. The video began. A man lay frail in a hospital bed, his breathing ragged and shallow, monitors beeping. Despite the tubes and machines, his voice, hoarse and direct, broke the silence. "I have been unfaithful. I abandoned my wife. I cannot undo that betrayal." But she stood by belief, and through every hardship, she carried you on nothing but love. It was she who paid for your education, paid off debt you did not know existed, with every cent she had. If you continue to reject her, you will receive nothing, just a single dollar. The rest of my estate, $56 million, belongs to my former spouse. Gasps fluttered across the room like startled birds. I felt my pulse slow, my skin prickled with cold fury and relief, hostage to a storm of emotions. Lydia sprang to her feet, her voice cracked, thick with fury. "No, that is not real. He would never do that." Her denial rang like a broken record against the somber weight of the video. The attorney let it hang. He pressed a remote and the video paused. Your father's final testament lingering in the air. Eyes widened around the room. Some scanned back and forth, taking in my tears, Lydia's panic, Derek's slack jaw, the hushed shock of the guests. I did not move. I cannot describe the strain of breath that filled my throat. The life I had led in shadow, paying debts, financing dreams, swallowing silent grief, all of it illuminated, undeniable. Lydia, her face ashen, demanded a second look. "That cannot be real," she insisted. "Where is this recorded? This cannot be valid." The attorney lifted the lid of an envelope. In it was the original will, stamped and witnessed. "He dictated it under his full faculties," the attorney said, "signed and notarized 2 weeks ago." A courtroom silence hung. Lydia sank into her chair with a hollow sound. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the long strain of my life ease a fraction. Around me a low murmur swelled. Some guests whispered, "I always suspected there was something she did not owe him. She gave until she had nothing left." Derek stood, fists clenched, face contorted with rage, but there was nowhere to direct it. I kept my gaze forward, steady and rehearsed. I was neither startled nor triumphant. I was the culmination of every choice, every sacrifice. Then the attorney pressed play again. My husband's face flickered in the light, pale and quiet. He said more, words that trembled, but carried weight beyond his frailty. "She deserves every cent. Let love be public now, not hidden behind grief or guilt. Let justice speak where hurt has been silent." The attorney shut off the video. Nothing moved for what felt like forever. Lydia bowed her head, hands over face, her composure shattered. Derek stared at the screen, mouth open. I rose from my seat, hands unwet by tears and heart light with a strange peace. Their world had tilted on that admission. My quiet persistence had become unbearable truth. This was not vengeance, it was justice. And as I walked forward, toward acknowledgement, and toward what remained of my silence. I felt, not triumph, but release. The attorney paused, went silent for a moment, and then pressed play on the screen. The worn face of my husband reappeared, paler, more fragile than before, but there was steel in his eyes. He held up a folder next to his chest, his hand trembling slightly as the nurses monitored his vitals. Then he spoke again, gravely and deliberately. My daughter must understand that everything she has, all the privileges, the opportunities, the lifestyle, comes from the life and sacrifice of her mother, not from me. I have transferred all my shares in the company and all property deeds into her name. That way it cannot be altered after my passing. If my daughter wishes to inherit any part of what I leave behind, she must acknowledge that her mother is the foundation. I demand that she stand up publicly and confess the truth she has denied. Only then will she receive her inheritance. The room shattered at that moment. Lydia's face went pale as she clutched the arms of her chair. Sparks of outrage danced in Derek's eyes. The attorney turned and slipped a thick stack of documents toward me. Original deeds, corporate transfer papers, property titles, all thoroughly annotated and solemnly executed under legal seal. I sat there, breathing slowly, while the orb of attention spiraled into chaos. Lydia rose, voice breaking and raw. "No, this is impossible. How could he do this without telling me? This is cruel. You cannot do this." She glared at the attorney, tears streaming down her cheeks, but he held firm. From behind, I heard hushed voices shift in tone. A friend leaned forward and whispered, "So she lived her whole life on the back of her mother's labor." Another voice added quietly, "She built her world on foundations someone else paid for." Derek erupted, shouting, "You stupid woman, now look what happens. You exposed yourself and now everyone sees it. I will not bow to that old woman." His words echoed like an insult no room could forget. Lydia sank into tears, face buried in her hands, legs shaking. Friends who had once fawned over her recoiled. Some stared in stunned realization. A mournful hum of recognition crept through the crowd, heavier than any pity. I remained still, upright in the center of this emotional storm. The attorney cleared his throat and said, "The transfers are complete. The signed documents are in my office, ready for final processing. Once you meet the condition, public admission and acknowledgement, you will receive your share. Until then, these assets remain under your mother's control." Lydia's shoulders slumped. Derek's posture sagged. The room spoke without words. This was not theatrical revenge, it was undeniable truth, cast in legal skin, floating over the bones of old lies. I looked at the papers. Deeds to the land, corporate share certificates, property titles. I thought of every sleepless night, every thrifted penny, every parent-teacher night attended alone, every night spent wrestling with guilt, sacrifice, silent prayer. I rose, drawing the papers gently closer to me. I inhaled, soft and solemn, holding my husband's voice inside me, the voice that demanded truth from a daughter who would not speak it. I stepped forward, toward Lydia. Her eyes met mine, red and wide as though seeing me for the first time, not as a mother or an inconvenience, but as the source, the anchor, the one who built lifeboats from her will. I did not speak. I only held her gaze, and at that moment the question was no longer what I would say. It was what she would do, because the stage had shifted. Their world was no longer safe with shadows and secrets. It belonged to the truth now, and that truth was mine. The room fell silent as the attorney produced a worn, yellowed envelope and set it gently on the table. Its presence seemed to draw the air out of the space. He cleared his throat and said softly, "This is a letter from your father, written shortly before he passed. He requested that it be read aloud in your presence." Lydia, hands shaking, glanced at me, then at the letter, her face pale and trembling. The attorney nodded to her and she swallowed hard before holding the paper to her chest. She looked out at the sea of relatives, so many who had once admired her grand wedding, her ambition. Now they watched with narrowed eyes, the air thick with judgment. She took a breath and began in that cracked, unsteady voice. "I know I have caused you pain. I have turned away from you and denied you the respect you deserved. I know that you paid my way through school, that you carried the burden of our family's survival on your shoulders. I know now that I owe you everything. I am so sorry, Mom. Please forgive me. Her voice broke and her gaze sank to the floor. Seconds later, she dropped to her knees right there, clasped my hand in both of hers, sobbing. The words came out ragged through tears. "Mother, I beg you, I ask for one chance, just one chance to make amends." I knelt beside her without a word, letting her lean into me, feeling the tears wet my sleeve. Behind us, the room was silent, and then phones came to life. People began pressing record. Some faces glowed with cold delight. I felt their eyes flicker from admiration to scorn as they witnessed the fall. "All that wealth and pride built on what? Her mother's labor," one whispered. Another shook her head. "This is exquisite karma." Lydia's body trembled in my arms. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, mascara running. She buried her face in my shoulder, a child again in need of her mother's mercy. I closed my eyes for a moment. There was no applause, no forgiveness proclaimed, just the raw weight of truth hanging in the air. I felt the camera's glare, the hum of whispers, the shift in their faces. Respect had slipped away as fast as trust once held, and the spectacle of her plea settled among the audience. They viewed her not through compassion, but through the lens of betrayal turned humility. Through it all, I held her hand, anchoring her trembling heart. I did not rush to speak. Silence carried its own power. She had delivered what the world demanded: acknowledgement, repentance, and submission to truth. And in that moment I realized this was not about forgiveness. It was the reclamation of my own story, my worth, and the reckoning of debts long owed. I felt her shake with grief, regret, and longing beneath my palm. The world watched, and the cameras clicked again. One by one, they recorded not just a fallen heiress, but a woman at the knees of consequence, begging for entry to a world she once claimed without making it. I squeezed her hand gently, steady and warm. Not a word passed my lips. But my silence was the vocabulary of justice. That moment would be the memory that shaped them. Not the day she was rich, but the day she owned that richness cost me everything. And as the gathering continued around us, the clack of heels and low chatter resumed. I stayed kneeling beside my daughter. Time had broken open, and she had walked into truth willingly, at last. The room had fallen still again when the attorney looked at me. His voice was neutral, almost clinical. "Mrs. Layla, as the sole inheritor of Mr. Blackwell's estate, would you like to allocate a portion to your daughter?" I did not flinch. I opened my bag, carefully pulled out a bundle of old papers, and laid them on the polished oak table for all to see. Bank receipts, tuition statements, records of debt I had paid on her behalf, pages yellowed by years but stamped and official. I pushed them forward, looked at her with eyes that had seen everything, and said calmly, "I raised you twice. Once with milk, once with tears. I have nothing left to raise you a third time." Lydia did not speak. She lowered her head, too ashamed to meet my gaze, her cheeks streaked with whatever remained of her pride. Derek shifted in his seat beside her, his lips pressed into a thin, angry line, already calculating what to take and what to leave behind. The attorney cleared his throat. "Then, by the directive of the will and the unchallenged conditions therein, the full estate, $56 million in cash, equity, property, and shares now legally belongs to Mrs. Layla Blackwell." Gasps rippled through the room. Some turned to stare. Others pulled out their phones. I saw Lydia's shoulders collapse, and Derek simply stood up and walked out, not even sparing her a look. But I was not done. I rose from my chair and pulled out one final envelope, handing it to the attorney. "Please read this aloud." He opened it and began, "Per the recipient's instructions, a charitable foundation is to be established with an initial funding of $12 million. Its name, the Layla Foundation for Daughters in Silence, offering scholarships, housing, and counseling for young women whose voices have been ignored in their homes." The silence broke into whispers, and then the headline came to life, as if summoned by fate itself. "Mother once cast aside, now becomes Texas' most honored philanthropist." They would write about this for weeks. They would remember not just the money, but the message. Outside the law office, the sun was shining. The breeze carried that dry, dusty scent unique to Texas, tinged with magnolia and old promises. I stepped into it slowly, the way you step into something you built from nothing. Behind me, Lydia sat slumped in her chair. Her name no longer opened doors. her husband gone, her circle dispersed. The girl who once shamed me for homemade clothes was now an emblem of public disgrace. The same crowd who had toasted her rise now scrolled past her fall. And I? I drew in a long, slow breath. It filled my chest the way silence had filled my life, strong, steady, and enough. Then I whispered, not to her, not to them, but to the world that had always watched and never spoken. People may forget sacrifice, but justice does not. And truth always finds its time. __song. The days that followed my daughter's public breakdown passed in a surreal blur. The inheritance was settled, the media had run their stories, and the world had moved on. But for me, a new beginning quietly emerged. I returned to Oak Haven Retirement Home, not as a timid visitor, but as a benefactor. Each morning I walked down the hallways with a gentle purpose, seeking more than prattle or pity. With the funds I contributed, the Layla Room Benefactor and Protector blossomed into a vibrant art studio. I opened its door one afternoon to find easels set in a sunny corner, jars of acrylic paint, bowls of clay, sketch pads spilling with possibility. A volunteer coordinator greeted me. "We thought it best you show us what to do. No one else had your style." I hesitated. My hands, once strong enough to carry homes, trembled at the weight of paintbrushes. Still, I dipped a fingertip into a tub of blue paint and wet the bristles. Even the simple act of pressing brush to canvas felt like stepping into daylight after winter. I decided right then I would teach myself to paint again, learn to express what words and tears could not. That evening, I brought in a watercolor set and began copying a simple, still lake, an apple, a jar, a pale cup. My first brush stroke was shaky. The next one bled out beyond the lines. Yet with each attempt, another flicker came alive, the desire to create beauty out of fractured memories. In those quiet afternoons, I met Ruth. She was a widow of 92, with bright gray curls and a feisty grin. She sat at the pottery wheel 2 stools over, shaping a bowl with deft fingers. At first, we nodded in perfunctory greeting. Then one day I said, "I am not sure if I'm doing this right, about my brushwork." She looked up, dark eyes steady. "You are letting your heart paint. That's the only way to do it." She smiled, and I felt a bond form, 2 women who had lived long enough to know what it meant to struggle, to break, to heal. We began teaching each other. I showed her muted watercolor washes. She taught me how to coax clay upward, building a lip around a vessel. We laughed over dropped chunks of clay, marred brushstrokes, and dried paint on fingertips. Soon we were inseparable, co-ambassadors of creativity at Oak Haven. Researchers say art and hobbies empower older adults, boosting mental acuity, diminishing loneliness, gifting joy. Studies show that creative arts increase brain activity and memory strength, and even help delay cognitive decline. I felt that power in my bones, in the ache of muscles I had forgotten, in the clarity blooming in my mind. My favorite time was Wednesday afternoon, when Ruth and I sat side by side as the art room filled with residents painting, molding clay, writing short poems in elegant calligraphy. We'd sip herbal tea afterward and walk in the garden behind the home, her telling stories of her childhood in the mountains, me sharing memories of Texas sunsets. She became my soul friend, my mirror, my witness, my laughter when I had none left. One crisp autumn morning, I brought my first completed canvas, an impression of the garden by the elder wing, pale yellow leaves drying on branches, the afternoon light soft on the benches. I held it uncertainly before the volunteers and staff. They clapped, a round of gentle applause that reached me like sunlight, and Ruth whispered, "You found form again." That night I heard my own heart sigh. Purpose, connection, beauty. I was not invisible, I was seen, not as a relic, not as a symbol, but as a person discovering joy. I began teaching weekly classes, no skill required, only willingness. I watched men who had never held a paintbrush learn to mix emerald green. I watched another woman who had feared clay cradle a pinch of earthen brown as though it were a newborn. Their laughter echoed off the tile floors, their concentration was profound, their happiness was tangible, and in that shared space, I regained something I had thought lost. Peace. Once I had moved with only regret and resolve. But now I built with color and laughter. Now I stood, not on the battleground of memory, but on the canvas of renewal. When the local newspaper caught wind of our classes, they ran a feature titled, "Grandma Turned Art Instructor at 78. I smirked when I read it, had to explain I was only 70-something, but it felt sweet to see my story cast in light again. Word of our little art haven spread, and soon local school children came for joint workshops. Ruth and I guided them, showing them how to blend shades, how clay yielded to gentle pressure, how even broken things, like shards from my picture frame years ago, could be made new with glue and intention. I realized then, purpose is not always inherited. Sometimes it is found. I painted more, I laughed more, I lived more. And each time I looked at my sunflower yellow canvas, or Ruth's flower bowl, or a child's finger-smeared painting of a cat with too many whiskers, I saw life's worth renewed. The world had tried to erase me, but this story, forged in paint, clay, and friendship, remained. I was not an obituary. I was a chapter still writing itself. If this story struck a chord with you, if it reminded you of the strength, the silence, and the quiet revenge only a mother can carry, then this is just one of many truths we share. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories for more powerful, raw, and unforgettable tales of women who endured, who rose, and who never needed to shout to be heard. Their silence held storms. Their stories sparked justice. New true stories every week. Click subscribe, turn on notifications, and honor the voices that never broke, even when the world tried to silence them. Grandma True Stories. Because behind every wrinkle, there's a revolution.